So section 5.3, this is all about those resistance, those very first acts of resistance. And so there's a lot that's going to go into it, to major things that are going to happen. So with these roots of resistance, you have your English common law. What is changing the English common law? Well, you have the American Enlightenment. Remember, that's changing thought patterns. And you have this addition of this want of Republican values. That idea of everybody deserves to be represented by qualified individuals who know what's going on in that area. So knowledgeable individuals. By February of 1768, Boston and New York begin to boycott all British goods, and they're going to encourage women to make their own cloth as well as their own tea, because tea is going to be a big thing that they're going to boycott. And the British colonists at that time, massive tea drinkers. It isn't until this time with the boycott that they're going to change from being tea drinkers to coffee drinkers. And coffee grown in South America, easily imported up to the American colonies. So they're going to push back against tea as something that the American colonists had. There's a group called the Sons of Liberty. They are going to form up. They're formed in Boston. They're going to have the catchphrase, no taxation without representation. They're going to pass the Stamp Act resolutions that are going to be sent to Parliament, saying that they could not be taxed without their say. And this right here, this is just a few people that are part of the Sons of Liberty. Samuel Adams, Benedict Arnold, John Hancock, Patrick Henry, James Otis Jr. at the top. In the middle, you have Paul Revere, James Swan, Alexander McDougall, Benjamin Rush, Charles Thompson. Then at the bottom, Joseph Warren, Marianus Willett, Oliver Wolcott, Christopher Gadsden, and Chaim Solomon. All of these individuals are going to be crucial when it comes to the Sons of Liberty and what they do. And they're going to put forth a lot of ideas and calling for things such as the non-importation movement. The idea of if we don't import things, then we can have leverage over that of Great Britain. It's the most powerful leverage that the colonists have, because it hits Great Britain right where it hurts the most, in the pocketbook. Colonists are going to sign an importation agreement saying they are not going to buy imported goods. Women can help. They're going to form the Daughters of Liberty. They're going to make their own cloth, their own tea out of herbs and flowers that they find in the American colonies. The Patriots see this as a way to restore colonial virtue as well, to establish themselves as their own true colony. Imports on British goods are going to drop by 40%, and that's really, really going to hit hard to the British economy. But now there are two big things that are going to happen that's really going to change the way people look at the colonies and the way the colonies look at their interaction with Great Britain. The first thing that is going to happen is going to be that of the Boston Massacre. It's going to happen March 5th, 1770, and it happened on State Street. So if you look at the top picture, it is this street right here as it moves through. The three main people that are involved is Private Hugh White, who's a British sentry at the Customs House, Edward Garish, who is a wig maker's apprentice, and Captain Lieutenant John Goldfinch. Now, it all starts with John Goldfinch is coming home at the end of the day. He is down on the Boston Harbors where his post was for the day, and he's headed home after a long day. And Edward Garish, a wigmaker's apprentice, he's about the age of 16. He starts taunting Goldfinch, saying that he never paid for 2 wigs that he ordered, and that he needs to go and pay the individual he's apprenticed to. John Goldfinch knew he paid for his wig, so he just kind of ignored Edward Garish as he was going on. When he gets up here to in front of the Customs House, so that's a larger building with the pier at the top, he decides to duck into the Captain of the Day's quarters, which is across the street. That's the other pictured building to the right. And he ducks into here and he decides to have tea with Captain Preston, who is the officer of the day. Now, Preston they sit and they talk for about an hour. During that hour, Edward Garrish leaves. And he takes his two buddies that are with him and they go home. After he leaves, Goldfinch continues about his journey and he continues home. Now, about an hour or two later, Garrish returns, and he doesn't have just his two buddies with him. He now has a group of teenage boys with him. And they start taunting at the door of Captain Preston's, the officer of the day's quarters. They do not get any response, so they decide to turn on the only British soldier that they can see, and that is Private Hugh White. So he's across the street in front of this doorway right here that I'm circling, which is down here in this picture, this yellow columned door on the bottom. Now, Hugh White is the sentry to the customs office. He as well is young. He's 16. He hasn't been in the colonies very long. This is his first post. And so Edward Garrish and his friends are going to turn on Hugh White, and they're going to start taunting him. Hugh White does his best to keep his composure, and they're going to start throwing snowballs, sometimes rocks, at him. So Hugh White is going to retreat into the customs house itself. In the customs house, there are two other individuals, another teenager and an older gentleman, and they're locking down the customs house for the day. Over the course of an hour or two more, the crowd is going to grow to about 300 to 400 individuals. They start throwing snowballs, icicles, oyster shells at the British. Basically anything they can to try to get them to come out. Captain Preston sees that this is happening, and he's less worried about the destruction of property and more worried about the people that are in the customs house. So he takes a group of soldiers that are in the Officer of the Day's building, and they march across the street and encircle the door. They lower their cannons, lower their rifles with bayonets attached, and to spread the crowd out so that they could go in, get the 3 people in, get them out, and they're just going to encircle them and march them across the street, get them into the Officer of the Day's house, and then just let the crowd do whatever. Unfortunately, while this is happening, local tavern keeper by the name of Hugh Montgomery is going to pull out a club, and he's going to hit one of the soldiers that are in that half circle, and he's going to fall to the ground. Now, we don't know exactly what started it. There are some reports that says that Captain Preston told them to fire. There are other reports that when the gun hit the ground, it went off. There was other reports that the soldiers just started firing into the crowd. No matter what the report is, the soldiers fired into the crowd. 11 people will be hit. 5 will die instantly. 8 more will be injured in the continued fight afterwards. Eventually, Preston gets those who are alive back into the Officer of the Day's house. The very next day, the Crown removes all troops from the fort in Boston Harbor, to the fort in Boston Harbor. So there are no British soldiers now in the streets of Boston. On March 27th, Captain Preston and 8 men will be indicted for murder. And news spreads really, really fast of what's happening. And that's because Paul Revere, who is a journalist, he owns his own newspaper, prints the story of how the colonists were standing outside the customs house having a peaceful assembly, and then the British started firing on them for no reason. And so that is the story many, many colonials knew for quite some time. But during the trial of Captain Preston and these 8 men, they will find out the true story of what happened. In the end, Captain Preston and 2 other men are going to be found guilty. And everyone but Preston and his lieutenant will be let go. So Preston and his lieutenant both their punishment is they are executed for the murders that happened during the Boston Massacre. Britain then modifies the Townshend Acts, repeals the Tea Act in hopes that it will lessen aggression that is going on in the colonies. It does not help, though, because now we have the Boston Tea Party is what's going to happen. 3 years later, Britain has tea now costs less than Dutch tea, and they're going to pass the Tea Act of 1773. Only the colonists are now paying the tax, remember that. But it is cheaper than that of Dutch tea. On December 16th, 1773, 3 years after the Boston Massacre, Governor Hutchinson is going to call a town meeting. And he tells the people there all they have to do is wait, and he'll show up and we'll discuss what is going on. Because there are 3 ships that are in Boston Harbor that are full of tea. And the colonials won't let them unload the tea. So Hutchinson says, we'll come together, we'll have a meeting, we'll talk about what's going on. When they get there, they're at the meeting for a couple hours and Hutchinson doesn't arrive. And so they send off for Hutchinson to find out where is he. And the person they send to find out comes back and says, Hutchinson isn't home. He hasn't been home for since the night before. He had packed up his family and he had moved to the countryside. And so he wouldn't be there. So he had no intention on being at this meeting. The meeting then turns into a riot. Then 24 men are going to march to the Boston Harbor. And we know who these 24 men were because they were in the Sons of Liberty. And they're going to march to the Boston Harbor, and they're going to divide up into 3 groups. They reported to have dressed like Indians. Basically, they stuck feathers in their hair and took off the shirts and put a little war paint on and rolled up their pant legs. That was it. Everybody knew who they were. So they're going to march to the harbor, and they're ordered to separate into the 3 groups and dump the tea in the harbor, but commit no other vandalism. Because anybody caught doing any other vandalism, they would be arrested for that by them, the people that are there. So they're going to do this. They're going to dump the tea out. It took about 3 hours to unload all the tea. They're surrounded by British armed ships and hundreds of British soldiers, but no order came for them to stop those individuals from dumping anything into the harbor, so they don't. There is going to be a lot of repercussions for this. And we know exactly what happened at the Boston Tea Party because 2 of the individuals who were at the Boston Tea Party that night went home and wrote exactly what happened from their own perspective. And they were from 2 different ships. And their tales virtually match. We know exactly, what happened because they're about the same. Plus we have the notes from the meeting earlier about how Hutchinson didn't arrive. So we know specifically what happened. There will be repercussions from that, some punishments that will come out, and that comes in the form of the coercive acts, also known as the intolerable acts. There are 5 of them. The Boston Port Act closed the Port of Boston until the price of the dumped tea was recovered. And they're going to move the capital of Massachusetts from Boston to Salem. The Massachusetts Government Act made all law officers subject to appointment by the royal governor only. No longer could someone be part of the colonials and be appointed unless the royal governor gave say. It banned all town meetings that didn't get approval by the royal governor as well. The Administration of Justice Act, which allowed the royal governor of the colony to move trials to other colonies or even to Great Britain if they thought that they wouldn't get a fair trial. And so they thought it would be easier to punish smugglers and punish those that were part of this if they could move the trial to another location. Anywhere within the colonies just wasn't going to work, though. They're going to change the Quartering Act, which allowed royal troops to stay in any house now or empty building if barracks were not available. And they didn't have to compensate them for it. They absolutely just had to give up area for these individuals to stay in. And then the Quebec Act granted civil government and religious freedom to Catholics. And that is one of the things that's really going to tick them off. But out of all of these intolerable acts, the one that's going to tick them off the most is going to be that of the fact that they gave Quebec a seat in the House of Commons. after they were told repeatedly that they would get representation and then they do not get representation, this is the thing that's going to really just send some people into that, absolutely, we have to remove ourselves from Britain. Rather than keep the colonists down like they thought, the intolerable acts stirred the revolutionary fever even more. So now we have this time where they're going to come together and really look at what can we do to fight back against Great Britain. So the next PowerPoint you're going to do is preparing for the revolution.